Hi, my name is Kristin. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist with the state of California. This is a webinar, so it's not a therapy, but it is basically a space where we can kind of educate on and explore the topic of how to relate to other human beings, right? So how do we form romantic relationships? How do we communicate with our loved ones? How do we disagree with them? And more importantly, probably many of you want to know, how do you kind of vet and assess the people in your life for safety and repair potential ruptures in trust and love? So these are all kind of subjects that I've talked about in previous webinars. And of course, the ultimate goal for a healthy relationship with anyone is for you to feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to show your good, bad, light, dark. Of course, that's always with boundaries, and I have other webinars that cover that. But a willingness to connect with others in a real, authentic, honest way versus maybe under false pretenses or as a chameleon or with manipulative or seductive tactics. So, but of course, before we can kind of cover or practice healthy relationships, we need to become masters in knowing what gets in the way of our connection with others, what is always going to be an obstacle to vulnerable, authentic, healthy connection with others. And that is why today we're going to talk about shame. So in a really quick soundbite from Brene Brown, and I'm going to be sharing a couple of her books, and they'll be in some of the links. This is one of her very original ones. It's her old school one. Shame is the intensely painful feeling within us, or an experience of believing that we are flawed, and so flawed that we are therefore unworthy of acceptance and connection with others and belonging. Basically, you have to understand that we are neurobiologically made to connect with everyone. So that means lots of feel-good hormones come out that say, yeah, this feels good when you're in a deep talk with someone, sex, hugging, when you achieve great things and you're excited to share them with friends and family. That's all saying, yeah, connection is great. We need people in our life. And then conversely, we feel deep, uncomfortable, horrible feelings when we're in a state of disconnection, when we've been caught in a lie, when we're in an argument with someone, when someone leaves this earth and passes away. That is deep suffering from feeling like we are in disconnection. As long as we have that neurobiological drive to connect with others, and as long as we're driven for love and connection with others, the threat of disconnection, which is shame, will always be a part of our life. Dan Siegel explained that he thinks that shame is kind of this maladaptive, kind of messed up way that our brains have made us believe that we have some sort of control over whether or not we get to control somebody or connect with somebody else. So let me explain that. So let's say children, they're born kind of egocentric. Everything they think happens because them, for them, around them. And their brain slowly expands to understand bigger and greater concepts outside of them as they grow. Shame, he kind of argues, is this idea that, when mom doesn't pick me up on time, when dad doesn't show up for my birthday party, when even mom and dad are fighting with each other, the way that I kind of survive that stress is to go, oh, well, maybe if I was a better kid, they'd show up on time. Maybe if I was more noticeable and got their attention or got straight A's, then he wouldn't miss my birthday party. Or maybe if I'm really, really good and I clean up my room, then they won't fight anymore and they won't get divorced. It's kind of this like, I thought that was a really interesting way of understanding how kind of deeply woven shame is in our neuroscience, because I want you to understand that shame is extremely subconscious. I mean, the story I always tell is shame, and this whole Brene Brown stuff was part of my treatment curriculum for months and months and months. And I would give it to clients, I would explain it, and I could totally connect with it in a rational, cerebral kind of way. But it was months of listening to it before I started realizing that shame affects all facets of my life. And I do agree that I think it affects, as long as you want to connect with people, there's always going to be this fear that you're not enough, and you may be disconnected because of it. And it will muddy the waters. It messes up and destroys our mental health and our relationships. Shame is kind of this silent enemy that we don't even know we're fighting against. And it's just kind of out there, stealing our joy and our potential. So one of my greatest efforts in life is to help people develop a language and an understanding for knowing how shame is present in their life. Because there's other emotions that kind of get tied in and mixed in with shame, and that needs to be broken apart. So I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But as long as we that we have to make it a part of our everyday conversation, because you can't discuss love, relationships, addiction, any of our life struggles without understanding how shame plays a role in all of that. So again, some of the books, if what I'm saying to you is interesting, I'm just going to take a little bit of a moment to say that these are some of Brene Brown's books that she's so very famous for. She's a Oprah disciple. But anyway, but basically, this is a really quick synopsis of what is shame and what is it not, because again, it can get confusing. Shame is essentially a focus on yourself versus a focus on the external life around you, or a behavior or a choice you made. So shame makes you feel completely disconnected. It makes you feel unworthy. It's not something that you want to share with anybody because of those reasons. And it leads us to destructive behaviors like maybe lashing out in anger, shaming others. So putting them down, making them feel bad about themselves, or hurting ourselves or others. They also shame is the driver of an addiction cycle as well. Shame is highly correlated with addiction, with depression, with the need to bully, with suicide, and violence. Also, something that's important to know, that if this whole time you're kind of looking and going, oh, I never had a parent who was like, oh, you're a bad kid, you're a bad person. I want you to understand that shame is all around us. Everyone has to deal with it, but you can be deeply affected by shame triggers, shaming concepts, having never had it directly pointed at you. So I think, body image. I never had a parent that was like, Kristin, you're fat, or hey, being beautiful is really important. But I definitely watched my mom stand in front of a mirror and criticize her appearance, and she was 5'2" and probably 100 pounds. The point is, there was nothing to criticize. She was a beauty queen. But I watched that and I was like, wow, if that's, shameworthy, then what am I? Conversely, productivity, I have this need constant. If I'm not producing something, if I'm not achieving, then I'm kind of worthless. What am I? And I never had anyone point the finger and say that to me, but I watched other people judge people who would produce, and I'd watch people get gold stars and awards and say, oh, I want that. And then conversely, people kind of get made fun of for getting bad grades, or for being called losers or things like that. So I'm trying to let you know that it's not always about what someone's saying to you, at you specifically. You're observing these things and absorbing these kind of core beliefs and shame messages. So there's a couple emotions that Brene Brown says get intertwined with shame and confused with them. That's guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. We're going to talk about that. So shame versus guilt, they are two very different things. Shame is completely unproductive, always destructive, always correlated with negative mental health experiences and behaviors. Guilt, on the other hand, is kind of this uncomfortable feeling that is focused on your behavior, of like, wow, I made this mistake. I shouldn't have lied about not finishing my homework, or I shouldn't have kind of gotten mad at my kids when really I was just really tired and hungry. And that's saying, okay, that feels really yucky, because you need to go out and make that repair, kind of own accountability for it. So guilt can be productive. Shame would be me lashing out at my kids because I was tired and hungry and going, God, I am a crappy mom. I just cannot get my priorities straight. I am working too hard. I feel like I'm not eating healthy, and my kids are driving me crazy and I have no patience for it. I'm failing at this whole parenting thing. That's shame. Could you imagine how you would process that situation differently if you viewed it through a shame lens versus seeing it through a guilt lens? So guilt is bad choices, and shame is I'm a bad me. So, and then the other emotion that it gets confused with is humiliation. Humiliation gives off this flare of, I didn't really deserve that, right? So there's this kind of, because you don't feel like you deserve it, it's not penetrating this kind of deep intrinsic, like I'm a bad person. It kind of almost ignites this anger, of like, she had no right to yell at me that way, or if my boss got down at me, it's something I did or didn't do. And it'd say, you know what, I tried my hardest to get that project done. I did my best. I had never done anything like that before. I can't even believe that he said all that stuff about me in front of the group of people. Like that was just a poor management decision, right? So the way that Brene Brown says it is, if someone is humiliated, they're going to feel comfortable with sharing it with someone and processing it with someone because they didn't feel like they deserved it. And they kind of want to process through the injustice. Whereas shame, it's so deep and dark in you that, oh my God, if I shared this story of how embarrassing it was, that my boss basically told me that I was this worthless employee that screws up all the time, I ain't going to want to share that with another person. That doesn't feel good. And so I'm going to keep it in this back dark, languageless part of my brain and feel terrible about it all day, and then go home and yell at my children.
Yeah.
So, and then shame also gets confused with embarrassment. Shame is not embarrassment. Embarrassment is this kind of fleeting emotion that will come and go. The biggest point is that often when you're embarrassed, you also feel comfortable with sharing the story. Sometimes it's even funny because when it happens, you realize it's relatable. I have this memory of just kind of falling flat on my face in front of a bunch of people. And because I felt very comfortable, like I didn't intrinsically think I'm a horrible person because I tripped and ate it in front of a ton of people, I felt comfortable with just laughing about it, and all of us laughing about it, because it was like, hey, look what I just did. Right? So that's kind of understanding how to unweave shame versus guilt, shame versus humiliation, and shame versus embarrassment. You understand with embarrassment that you're not the only one to experience this moment. So therefore, you're okay with going out and talking about it. A really great way that Brene Brown explains that you can kind of discover what your deepest shame fears are is to really sit down and explore. If you have a therapist, great, or in a 12-step group of some kind, or a group of friends, safe friends. Some concepts around how you think the messages you've received in life of how you should be, what you should be, and who you should be. She says shame basically will come when you kind of get poked with that fear that, uh-oh, people are perceiving me in the way that I didn't want them to perceive me, right? So you need to fill in the blank of when you're just exploring your shame triggers. I want others to perceive me as fill in the blank. And then conversely, I want you to explore, I do not want others to ever perceive me as fill in the blank. So figure out these unwanted identities versus what your ideal selves are. I'm currently working on this worksheet. I was just talking to Tammy about it. I'm going to try to post it, but it's just these different categories of your life. And it's a really nice kind of cerebral way of exploring, like, what are these concepts that you have around how you're supposed to look, your professional life, your family life, being a parent, your religion, following rules or not following rules, creativity, all these elements of life where we can experience deep shame. And I want you to understand, in order for us to get out of that shame hole, we've got to become masters of it. So let's talk about that. So as Brene Brown says, there's a few minutes left and then I'll be done. There is no cure for shame, because again, as long as we have that drive to be loved, to be in connection with others, we will always have that fear that we're not enough in the back of our head. So it will always be there. So just know that. But the key to getting out of it is what we call shame resilience, right? So a resiliency from the shame that might come over us. And the key steps for that are that you must obviously be able to recognize when it's happening. So your face gets red, your heart rate goes up, you get sweaty, you feel this deep churning. I know one of my big signs is I get spinning thoughts that I can't even like put together. All I know and is that I think all these things, I feel really angry is usually my response to shame. I feel really shut down. It starts bleeding into every other aspect of my life. So I know that it's time to stop, pause, and figure out what happened, that, you know, what was said to me, what I did to make me feel in shame. The important part is you cannot blame, you cannot, you know, blame off the shame. You cannot numb out the shame. You cannot dull it. We try to, but because it's extremely uncomfortable. But that is the key, is that you have to stay present with it, get curious about it, and explore it. The other part of recognizing it is to become a master of what your shame issues are. I can list right now that I become the deepest in shame when I feel like there's anyone picking up the perception that I may be incompetent, if I'm a bad therapist, if I'm flaky, if I'm emotionally unstable, if I'm a bad parent, if I, you know, am not a healthy, attractive appearing person. Those are all my shame triggers. They're going to be different for everybody else. So it's important that you do your individual work to figure that out. The second step after you recognize it is to move through the shame in a constructive versus destructive manner. And you can do that by what she calls a critical awareness of the shame. So like I said, with that exercise that I just showed you, that's a work to understand where that shame came from personally, like what kind of messages you heard in your life to make you believe that, from your family structure or just your immediate environment around you, and societally, right? So I live in Southern California. I went to USC. I was just surrounded by people who look like they just kind of woke up out of bed looking beautiful and amazing. And so I can kind of understand that societally and familially and personally, I just have these messages that have put a very high, strong emphasis and priority on beauty equals, I don't know, fill in the blank, winning, better, important, loved, connected. That's what beauty meant to me. And now that I can kind of verbalize and understand that, it's a reality check for me. I can run it through a healthier vetting system when I feel shame around it. I can understand why it exists in me, how it works in me. And then I can just process it more easily. Steps 3 and 4 are the very important final steps, which are the urge when you are in shame. Ironically, when you feel like you're not worthy for connection, is to, of course, pull back, isolate, maybe throw the shame at somebody else through, you know, reshaming them back, or getting angry at somebody else, blaming someone else for your own shame. But the key is to do the opposite, which is reach out, do not isolate, do not hide it, speak out the shame, normalize it. And usually it's when you're in that connection with another person, because we all have shame, we all experience it. They're going to often say, oh yeah, me too. Maybe not in the exact same capacity, but it's like, yeah, you know, while I'm getting older, I find myself really struggling with, you know, my looks going or gaining weight. Oh, okay, so I'm not the only one. And yeah, and I know you, and you seem like a great person, and I don't judge you for it. So why the heck do I put myself through such a judgmental filter of I'm good and bad based on this really arbitrary measurement of worth? It's really arbitrary. So when she says this, and I like the way that it's put, when you own your story of your struggle, of your shame, you get to write the ending. You get to be the owner of the ending. However, if you don't own it, if you isolate from others, if you hide the story, if you are a chameleon to the story and you just deny its existence, then the story owns you. And then you can kind of keep wearing that victim crown where things just keep happening at you, to you. And so that's just kind of the synopsis for shame. I'm going to be continuing in other series talking about the kind of counter measure to shame, which is authenticity and vulnerability. And we'll continue to explore that subject matter. But any questions or comments along the line?
So much great stuff. I was thinking about, in particular, all the subconscious messages, like you were talking about, as a child, that even if it's not said or articulated, it was demonstrated, that beauty is, or, if a parent is focused on something. For me, it was grades. It's like, if I got an A-, it was like, why didn't you get an A? What's wrong with you was the message to me of that. So I really appreciated the discussion between what is shame versus guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. And was even thinking kind of when you were wrapping up is like, if I'm verbalizing it and talking about it, I could take something that is feeling shameful, and if I'm talking to you, Kristin, and I go, oh, blah, 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 if I'm willing to take that risk, then it might turn into guilt, which I can get rid of, because then it's like, okay, that behavior wasn't my best one. I have struggled so much with, putting myself as good or bad. And I've worked really hard for myself as that wasn't your best choice. That wasn't, your best moment. That wasn't my best parenting moment, whatever. But that doesn't make me a bad person. I've had to really work on that because I wanted to go to that place, or I didn't even want to. I went to that place so easily of the shame of like, if they only knew me. You talked about if somebody catches you lying, even if I'm not caught lying, the secret, the shame of having the lie and knowing that if people really knew who I was, they wouldn't like me. They don't know who I am, so they pretend to like me because it's that facade that you were talking about, the chameleon. This is the person I'm being for you, but you don't really know me. So therefore, the shameful person that I am still knows that I'm not worthy. So I really, the embarrassment, oh my gosh, so many funny stories about that. But, like learning to laugh at myself and just being okay with, I am so not perfect, and that's just okay. And no one is. And I don't have to have this false pretense, has helped me. And it has reduced the shame. I thought it was interesting too, that you're talking about, you can never get rid of shame. It's always going to be there. It's just learning how to deal with it and articulate it. And that attachment and talking about it is the cure, so to speak, for the shame. And I thought, wow, that really has been true for me too, because with addiction, it was all about numbing out, escaping, being angry at other people, doing whatever to deflect it. And even though I was holding it in, it was still, anger and raging it out. But to learn how to connect with people in a real way and be as transparent as I possibly can with people. Not everybody's going to like me, and that's okay. And I've learned that that's okay. I don't have to like everybody. They don't have to like me. But there used to be this huge, I was shameful. If you didn't like me for whatever reason, it was a shame thing for me. And now it's just like that's just okay. So I love this topic. I know it's a tough one, and I know that we don't want to talk about shame, but it really is an important one. So